He had ridden past her once already. That was the part he never told anyone in the years that followed. Not the deputies who took his statement, not the woman herself when she finally asked. Caleb Ward had seen the body in the dirt at the edge of the freight road, taken her for dead, and kept riding. It was a quarter-mile down the trace before something in him broke and turned the horse around. A man who had spent 12 years being no one to anybody had just remembered he used to be someone. The bay didn't like the turn. He felt it in the reins, a stiffness in the neck, ears swiveling back the way they had come. Caleb let the horse find its own pace and kept his eyes on the line of the wire fence, on the telegraph poles running due east toward Fort Stockton, on anything but the shape lying half on the road and half in the dry grass. Then he was over her, looking down. She was younger than he had thought from saddle, 25 maybe. The right side of her head was opened where something heavy had struck her, and the blood had dried in her hair the color of old rust. Her dress had been white once. It wasn't white now. A patterned shawl, the kind a woman from the South Texas hill country might weave, was wrapped around her shoulders and torn at the knot. 3 of her fingers had gone blue at the tips. He stepped down. The first thing was to know if she was breathing. He pressed the back of his hand to her mouth, held it there, waited. The wind moved the dry grass along the road, and he could hear his own heart in his ears. And then he felt it, faint, slow, warm against his knuckles. "All right," he said, more to himself than to her. "All right, we'll see." He worked with the calm he had spent a long time building. Checked the skull wound, no bone moving under his fingers. Ran his hands along her arms and ribs. One rib was tender. She made a small sound when he touched it. Both legs were whole. The damage was the head, and whatever was happening inside that he couldn't see. The bay had wandered down the road and was eating from a stand of buffalo grass. Caleb whistled, low. The horse came back without hurry. He didn't try to put her in the saddle. He laid her across the front of it, head to one side, her body slack as a deer carcass, and he walked the bay home. The ranch house was 3/4 of a mile up the draw, set against the cottonwoods where the seep came out of the limestone. He walked the whole way slow, one hand on her wrist to keep her from sliding, the other holding the reins loose. Halfway there, he stopped and looked back at the freight road. There was no one on it. The dust hung undisturbed. Whoever had left her had done it earlier, a few hours, maybe more. He thought about that, about the kind of men who beat a woman to death and ride on without burying her. He kept walking. The ranch house was sod-walled at the base and timbered above. 2 rooms, a kitchen, and a back room with a single iron bed. He had built most of it himself. The stove was a small cast iron box he had freighted up from San Antonio in '78. A Winchester rifle hung on pegs above the door. He had not taken it down in 3 years. He laid her on the kitchen table. The light was good there. He worked the dress off her shoulder enough to see the bruise running from collarbone to hip, boot heel shaped, methodical, more than one. He took a pan of water from the stove, a clean cotton shirt for cloths, his razor, and a needle and thread. The skull wound he stitched first. 8 stitches along the temple, neat, the way an army surgeon had taught him at a winter camp on the Brazos in '69. He worked without talking. She did not stir. Her breathing stayed shallow and even, and her pulse stayed where it had been on the road. Present, too slow, but there. When he had cleaned her face, he saw she was beautiful, in the way frontier women sometimes were when you scraped the road off them. Dark hair, dark brows, a small white scar above the left eye that had healed years before. Mestiza, he thought. Hill country, by the shawl. A long way from home. He covered her with a blanket and stood at the table looking down at her for a moment. Then he went outside to her saddle blanket. It had been stripped off her horse, wherever the horse was, and rolled, and shoved under a mesquite tree about 10 feet from where she had fallen. He had brought it back without thinking, the way a man brings things back when he doesn't yet know why. Now he laid it on the porch boards in the sun and ran his hand along the inside seam. The papers were there. 2 folded sheets, oilcloth wrapped, sewn into the lining with a stitch any rancher would recognize. He cut the thread with his pocket knife and unfolded them on his knee. Deed of land, Bandera County, 320 acres on the Medina River. Filed in the name of Tomas Vega, July 1879. Endorsed over to Marisol Vega by signature dated 6 weeks ago. The endorsement had a different hand than the original deed, and the signature shook the way a man's signature shakes when he knows what's coming. He sat on the porch step and looked at the papers a long time. Then he folded them, put them back inside the saddle blanket, set the blanket inside the door, and walked out to the gate to look down the freight road. She woke once that afternoon. He was sitting in the chair by the bed when her eyes opened. She did not move her head. She moved her eyes only, found him, and held there. "You're at the Ward place," he said quietly. "Northwest of Stockton. You were on the road. I brought you in." She swallowed. Her throat worked dry. "Water?" he said. She made the smallest motion with her chin. He brought the tin cup and tipped it carefully against her lips. She drank a swallow, then another. "What's your name?" he said. She closed her eyes a moment. He thought she had gone again. Then her lips moved. "Marisol." "Marisol what?" She did not answer. Her breathing was already slowing, dragging her back. He set the cup down. "All right," he said. "Marisol's enough." She went under. He sat with her another minute, then stood and walked to the door and out onto the porch. The light had gone amber. The wind had dropped. The cottonwoods stood still. He was looking east, toward the freight road, when he saw the dust. It was a long way off, 3, maybe 4 miles, but it was rising in the way dust rises when more than one rider is making it, and they aren't in any hurry. He stood at the porch rail and watched it for a full minute, long enough to know it wasn't going around the ranch. It was coming up the draw road that branched off the freight trace and led to his gate and to nothing else. He went inside. He took the Winchester down from the pegs above the door for the first time since he had hung it there. The metal was cool. He worked the lever once, carefully, the dry click of the action loud in the room. A cartridge rose. He thumbed it back into the magazine and set the rifle on the kitchen table next to the basin of pinked water and the needle and thread. Then he went to the back room and stood looking at the woman in the bed. She had not moved. "Marisol," he said. She did not answer. He pulled the blanket up to her shoulder and tucked it under her arm, the way a man does when he is buying himself a moment to think. When he straightened, he was looking at the small window above the bed. The light through it had gone the color of a bruise. He walked back to the kitchen and looked through the front door at the gate and at the dust beyond the gate, and he stood there a long time, with the Winchester behind him on the table, and he thought about a man with a roan horse he had not let himself think about in 12 years. In the telegraph station at Bell's Crossing, 20 miles east on the freight road, a clerk by the name of Beasley took down a wire from Bandera that read, "Reward, $200, return. Mexican woman Marisol Vega, dark hair, 5'2", traveling with deed papers. Approach with caution. Armed companion possible. Inquire, J. Coyle Bandera." He copied it twice, once for the file and once for the corkboard above his desk, and he was reaching for the second copy to pin it up when Augustus Tate walked in the door with his hat in his hand and a smile that asked Beasley if he had any messages worth a man's time. Beasley, who knew Tate by sight and did not love him, slid the copy face down across the counter. "Anything come in for you?" Beasley said. "Nothing for me," Tate said. He glanced down at the face-down sheet. "What you got there?" Beasley said nothing. Tate waited. After a moment, Beasley turned the sheet over. Tate read it. "Much obliged," he said. He set a silver dollar on the counter and walked out. 20 miles to the west, late in the afternoon of the same day, Caleb stood at the porch rail and watched the dust come up the draw road, and the only thing that moved on him was his eyes. 2 riders. He could see the shapes now, the lead horse smaller and quicker than the second, both at a steady working trot, both pacing themselves the way men pace themselves when they know exactly how far they have come and exactly how far they have left to go. He waited until they crested the rise where the road bent at the cattle guard. The lead horse came over first. It was a roan, with a white blaze that ran from the forehead to between the nostrils and stopped at the muzzle in a clean line, the way a stripe of paint stops where the painter ran out of paint. Caleb had seen that horse last in the spring of 1869 on a creek bottom in McLennan County, with a man on its back who had been wanted in 3 counties and who had bargained his way clear by giving up the names of 2 other men who weren't half as guilty as he was. He had stood in the rain that night and watched the man ride off, and known he would see him again. He had not expected it to be 12 years. The roan slowed at the gate. The man on it raised a hand, palm open, the old cavalry salute, and held it there. "Hello, the house," he called. Caleb did not move. The second rider eased up beside the first and stopped his horse a half-length back. Younger, 21, 22, sandy hair under a flat-brimmed hat, a sharp's carbine in a saddle scabbard, his hand near the stock the way a man rests his hand near a stock when he hasn't yet learned not to. "Hello, the house," the older man called again. Caleb let the silence run long enough to mean what he wanted it to mean. "State your business," he said. The older man smiled. He had a gray mustache that came down past the corners of his mouth and stained yellow at the tips from tobacco, and his teeth, when he smiled, were the teeth of a man who had been smiling at people he intended to harm for 30 years. "My business is a Mexican woman," he said. 5'2", dark hair, dressed in white. She'd have come up the freight road from Bandera, carrying papers that don't belong to her. There's a reward of $200 for her return, payable in Stockton, and I've come to collect it. Caleb's hand was on the porch post. He let it stay there. "Haven't seen her," he said. The older man kept smiling. He looked past Caleb at the house, at the open front door, at the porch boards, at the basin still sitting on the kitchen table where Caleb had not yet emptied it. His eyes, even at 30 feet, found the pinked water in the basin without trouble. "You sure about that, friend?" "I'm sure." "All right then." The older man lowered his hand. "We'll just water our horses at your trough, if it's no offense, and ride on." "Trough's dry." The older man laughed. The sound carried. "Well," he said, "that's a shame." He sat his horse another few seconds, looking at the house and at Caleb and at the empty stretch of yard between, and then he reined the roan around and walked it slow back down the draw, and the young rider followed him, and the dust they raised drifted east and settled in the dry grass. Caleb watched them out of sight. Then he went inside and closed the door. She was awake. She had pulled herself up against the headboard in the back room and was sitting with the blanket clutched at her collarbone, and her face still the gray of a person who has lost too much blood. Her eyes found the Winchester on the kitchen table through the open doorway. "Who was that?" she said. Her voice was thin, but it was steady. He crossed the room and stood at the foot of the bed. Older man, gray mustache, on a roan with a white blaze. Tate. It was not a question. He looked at her. She looked back. "You know him," he said. "I know him." She closed her eyes, opened them. "He works for a man named Coyle, out of Bandera. Coyle wanted my husband's land for a railroad survey. When my husband wouldn't sell, Tate took care of it. 6 weeks ago, on our own porch." She said it without any tremor. The tremor would come later, when there was time for it. "And the deed?" "In the saddle blanket." "I know," he said. "I read it." She nodded, once. That was permission given and accepted. "My brother has a place on the Pedernales," she said. "My sister and her boy are there. If I had ridden north from Bandera direct, Tate would have followed me to my brother's gate. So I came west. I made sure he knew I came west. I drew him off." He looked at her a long moment. "You set yourself out as bait." "I set the deed out as bait. I came with it because the deed wouldn't ride alone." He sat down on the edge of the bed, not close enough to crowd her, close enough for her to see his face. "How long since you ate?" 2 days. "All right." He went to the kitchen and built up the fire and put a pan of beans on with a piece of salt pork and a chopped onion, and while it heated, he set the Winchester back on its pegs above the door and took down a Colt revolver from a peg lower and to the right and laid it on the table where the rifle had been. The beans were good. Caleb had not made beans for another person in 6 years, and he had forgotten that he was good at it. She ate slowly, sitting up in the kitchen now with the blanket around her shoulders and the colorful shawl folded across her lap. She had washed her face at the basin, and the bruise under her eye had purpled in the way bruises do once the swelling starts to come down. She watched him while she ate. He let her watch. When she had finished, he took the bowl from her and set it in the basin. "Ward isn't the name I came west with," he said. She did not look up. "I figured. It's not a story I tell. You don't have to tell it." He stood at the basin with his hands resting on the rim and his eyes on the small window above it. Outside the window, the cottonwoods were going dark green in the failing light, and beyond the cottonwoods, the wire fence ran north, and the wire was humming faintly in the wind, the way the wire on the telegraph line a half-mile up the draw hummed in any wind worth the name. "Ward was my mother's family name," he said. "I took it because it was the only one I had any right to." She looked up then. "What's the other one?" He did not answer for a long time. "Killian," he said. She watched him. "All right," she said. That was all. She did not press. She set her hands in her lap on the folded shawl and looked at the little window with the green light coming through it, and they sat in the kitchen together while the light went out of the day, and neither of them said anything for a long while. 2 miles east, on a low rise where the freight road came up out of a dry wash, Augustus Tate sat on a fallen cottonwood log and ate a strip of dried beef and watched the sun get low. Henry Rowe sat 10 feet away, his back against his saddle, his sharps across his knees. "He had her," Tate said. Rowe didn't answer right away. He had been with Tate for 4 months, and he had learned that sometimes Tate spoke, and sometimes Tate was thinking out loud, and it was important to know which was which. "Saw the basin?" Rowe said finally. "Saw the basin. Saw the bloodied water. Saw the door open to the back room, and the back room door cracked the way a man cracks it when there's somebody on the other side he's listening for." Tate spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "He's quick," he said, "and he's careful, and he did not blink when I said her description." "You think he knows her?" "I think he's the kind of man who doesn't blink when he ought to." Rowe shifted against the saddle. He looked at the back of Tate's head and at the gray hair over his collar and at the way Tate's right hand rested easy on his knee. "What do we do?" "We go in at twilight. I don't want to give him the night to think." Rowe was quiet a moment. "What if he's ready?" Tate turned his head and looked at Rowe. "Then he's ready," he said, "and we'll do it ready." He kicked dirt over the small fire he had not built, out of habit, and he stood up. The dust on the draw road came again at twilight. Caleb stood at the porch rail and watched it. The 2 horses came up over the rise the way they had before, but this time they did not stop at the cattle guard. They came on, and the lead horse came right up to the gate, and Augustus Tate raised his voice in the failing light and said, "Sergeant Killian, step out where I can see you." Caleb's hand was on the door latch. The Winchester was behind it. He had set her at the window beside the door, with the Winchester laid across the sill and the lamp behind her doused so her shape would not show. He had told her, without taking his eyes off Tate's roan, "If it goes wrong, you shoot him in the right hand. Not the chest, the right hand." Then he pulled the door shut and stepped onto the porch with the Colt already in his hand at his thigh. The light was the full deep blue of a summer dusk in West Texas, where the day held on at the rim of the sky, and the ground was already in shadow. The cottonwoods behind the house were black against the blue. The wire fence ran out to the north in a line that disappeared into the dark, and the wind that had been moving in the dry grass earlier had dropped to nothing. Tate sat his roan 10 feet from the gate. Rowe sat his horse a half-length back, a little to Tate's left. "Sergeant Killian," Tate said, "that name's not been used in a long time." "I imagine it hasn't." Tate's hand was resting on his pommel. He kept it there. "I knew it was you," he said. "Soon as you stood on that porch this afternoon. I have a memory for men I've stood across from in the rain." "What do you want, Tate?" "The woman." She isn't yours. She isn't yours either, Sergeant, Tate said it pleasantly. She has property she stole from a man in Bandera. I've been hired to recover that property. I expected to find her on a road. I find her in your kitchen. That's no business of mine. The woman is. Caleb said nothing. I'll be candid, Tate said. I don't relish what comes next. I don't dislike you. I never did. You did your job in '69. You did it better than the men around you did it, and that's what cost you. We both know what cost you. I've thought about it a few times over the years. A man can't be sorry for the way the world arranges itself, but I'm not glad. You sold men to walk free. I gave names. I gave names to men in suits who would have made up names if I hadn't given them. The result was the same. The only difference was who walked out the door first. That's a comfort you tell yourself. It's a comfort I earned. Tate's hand had not moved. Sergeant, step aside. The woman comes with me. The papers come with me. You stay here. By morning I'm gone and you can go back to being whoever you've been. No. Tate nodded slowly, as if Caleb had given him the answer he had expected, and the part of him that had hoped for a different one was settling. All right, he said. His hand left the pommel. The shot from the window beside the door cracked the dusk before Tate's hand reached his hip. It took Tate's hat off and put a furrow across his right wrist that opened the sleeve and the skin under it, and turned his hand into a useless dead weight at the end of his arm. He looked at it once, almost without surprise, and then he was looking up again, and he was reaching across his body with his left hand for the gun he had not had time to draw with his right, and Caleb's Colt came up. One shot. Tate went off the roan sideways and landed in the dust at the gate and did not move. The roan shied. Roe's horse shied. Roe had his hand on the stock of the sharps, and he had not gotten it out of the scabbard, and now he was looking down the barrel of Caleb's Colt, across 30 feet of yard with the gun still pointed at the place where Tate had been a half-second before. Don't, Caleb said. Roe did not. His hand opened. The sharps slid back into the scabbard, and the hand came up empty, and Roe held it there. Down, Caleb said. Roe came down off the horse slow. Step away from the rifle. Roe stepped. Walk to the gate. Roe walked. When he was at the gate, Caleb told him to stop, and Roe stopped. And Caleb came down off the porch with the Colt still in his hand, and he walked across the yard to where Tate lay in the dust. He looked at him a long moment. Then he took the gun from Tate's holster, the one Tate had been reaching for with his left hand, and he tossed it underhand into the dry grass beyond the fence. He looked at Roe. How old are you? 21, sir. Sister? Roe blinked. Yes, sir. 1. She's 19. Get on your horse. Roe stood there. Get on your horse, son. Take Tate's roan. Ride east. If I see you west of the Pecos again, I will not give you this morning twice. Roe got on his horse. He took the roan's reins. He did not look at Tate. Tell whoever sent him, Caleb said, that the deed on the Vega land is filed clean, and that Coyle's name is going on a wire to the Texas Rangers in Austin tonight. The next man who rides up that draw road will not ride out. Roe nodded once, sharp. Go. Roe went. Caleb stood at the gate and watched him out of sight, and only when the dust had settled in the dry grass did he turn back to the porch. She was at the kitchen table with the Winchester across her lap and, her left arm bleeding through the sleeve where Tate's first round, the one he had gotten off as he fell, had grazed her above the elbow on its way through the open window. He saw it and put the Colt down on the table and went to her. It's nothing, she said. Let me see. It's nothing. Marisol. She let him see. He cut the sleeve away and cleaned the graze and bound it with strips from the same cotton shirt he had used in the morning. She watched his hands while he worked. The lamp on the table was lit again, and the light made his face older than it was. When he had tied the binding off, he sat down across from her. My name, he said, is Daniel Killian. I was a sergeant in the Texas Rangers, Company B. I resigned in the spring of 1869 over a man named Augustus Tate, whom you saw earlier, whom I did not kill in '69 when I had the chance, and whom I have killed tonight because I should have killed him then. She looked at him. Marisol Vega, she said. Born in Bandera County, October the 8th, 1854. Widow of Tomas Vega. owner of 320 acres on the Medina River. Pleased to know you, Daniel. He almost smiled. Pleased to know you, Marisol Renata. She looked down at the Winchester in her lap. My father taught me, she said, when I was 11. He taught you well. He did. She laid the Winchester on the table and put her good hand over his. The lamp burned. The night came on. Outside in the yard, the body lay where it had fallen and would lie until morning, and somewhere a wire on the telegraph line hummed in a wind that had come up again and carried the news of nothing in particular toward Fort Stockton, where in a few hours it would carry something else. By dawn he had her on the bay and Tate's body wrapped in a tarp on the back of the roan, and they rode east together as the sun came up over the high desert and threw their shadows long behind them on the freight road. In Fort Stockton, the circuit deputy was a man named Hollis, who had come up through the Rangers himself, and who was old enough to remember a sergeant in Company B who had walked out over a corruption matter no one had been ready to back him on. When Caleb came through the door of the deputy's office with Marisol on his arm and Tate on a horse outside, Hollis looked at him for a long 10 seconds before he stood up from his desk. Killian, he said. Hollis. I'd heard you were dead. I let it run that way. Hollis looked past him to Marisol, looked at the bandaged arm and the scar above her eye and the deed papers in her good hand, looked back at Caleb. That mess in the yard, Hollis said. Was that you? That was me. The lady fired the first round. I fired the second. Hollis sat down again. He picked up a pen, set it down. You know, he said carefully, that paper on you out of Brown County never did come down off the books. Officially, you're a man with an old warrant. Unofficially, every ranger in this state knows it was settled. I could let you ride. I know you could. And? Wire Austin. I want my service status pulled and updated. I want the Brown County paper closed off the books in writing. I want my name back on the rolls. After that, you can do what you want with me. Hollis looked at him. 12 years, Hollis said. 12 years. Why now? Caleb did not answer for a long moment. He looked at Marisol, who was standing very still beside him, with the deed papers in her hand, and the morning sun coming through the window behind her. Because, he said, a man who saves a stranger's life and then crawls back under his own name has not done either thing the way they were meant to be done. Hollis took up the pen. Sit down, Killian, both of you. This is going to take some time. They sat. Outside, the wind moved the dust on the boards of the porch and out across the freight road and down the wire that ran east toward Austin, and the wire carried what they sent it. That was the part of the story he did tell, in the years that followed, the riding back, the standing in the dust, the choosing of the harder road. The mile he had ridden past her in the first place was the part he kept. What he saved that day on the freight road was not only the woman, it was the man he had been before he taught himself to be no one. The cost of saving a stranger is sometimes the version of yourself you had been hiding in to stay safe. Somewhere in your own life, there is a road you rode past once. Maybe you turned around. Maybe you didn't. Maybe you watched somebody else turn around and you've thought about it ever since. Sit with that tonight. The frontier is gone. The choices it required of people have not gone anywhere at all.